Pete and I have known each other for, I just realized this morning, has it really been like 30 years?
It's been more than 30 years.
Isn't that insane?
I think it's been 32 years.
Wow. So Pete and I went to the New England Conservatory together, and he was a trumpet performance major along with me, and one of my closest friends. We've kept in touch all these years in our trials and tribulations, and super excited that he's here. And let me just say a little bit about his professional biography. I'll read a little bit here. Peter Myles was born in Nova Scotia, Canada, and has been a film music editor since 1998. He's a graduate of the New England Conservatory, BM in Trumpet Performance, and Northwestern University, the Masters of Music in Trumpet Performance, with additional studies at the Music Academy of the West and the Aspen Music Festival. As a trumpeter, he substituted with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, was a member of the Sarasota Opera Orchestra, and performed with the Boston Concert Opera Orchestra and numerous groups in the Boston and Chicago areas. Upon moving to Los Angeles, he joined the staff of Delos Records as a producer-editor, where he produced recordings of the Westminster Choir, flutist Pierre Rampal, tenor John Aler, and guitarist Paul Galbraith, among others. His list of film credits includes 3 installments in each of the Harry Potter, Bourne and Star Wars series, as well as Minority Report, War of the Worlds, Dune, Top Gun, Maverick, and many more. In addition to his film work, he has continued to work in the record industry with credits including John Williams' Cello Concerto, An American Journey, and more than a dozen film soundtracks. Welcome, Pete.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we want to talk about several things today. And, you know, you've been a music editor for many years now. It seems like kind of a niche, you know, kind of thing in the sort of Hollywood film place between like the director and a film score and all of that. Could you maybe give us a brief like synopsis of how you got into this industry from being a professional trumpet player?
The short version is that as a Canadian, I, you know, upon finishing my ability to stay in the States, I needed to figure out what to do with my life. So I had an opportunity to go to Rice and get my DMA, or I had an opportunity to go and work at a record company in Hollywood that somebody who I'd met at the Music Academy of the West had worked at. He had been a trumpet player and engineer and had graduated from Indiana University. And as an internship, he'd gone and worked at Delos Records. So he said, they're looking for somebody. And I was like, a job or DMA, job, DMA. And I decided to go for it and try this record stuff. So I went and worked at Delos for, I guess it was 3 years. They had a wonderful recording engineer named John Aler, who wrote the Handbook of Recording Engineering that I think is still used today to teach recording engineering. And it was an opportunity to really, you know, learn a new technology, learn how recording sessions worked. I ended up eventually, after doing some editing, getting a chance to produce, et cetera, et cetera. So it was really, it was an interesting place to work. It was a small company, but the record business was collapsing. So one day I said to our former trumpet teacher, Tim Morrison, hey, would you hand my resume to John Williams' music editor? And a couple of weeks passed and I called him back and I said, hey, Tim, did you get a chance to do that? He's like, oh, rats, I forgot to do that. So he did. So he ended up doing it like the next day. And then a day after that, I got this call from Ken Wannberg, who had been John Williams' music editor for 25 years. And Ken said, I'd like to meet you for lunch. Can you meet this Thursday or whatever, something like that? And I said, absolutely. So we met at a restaurant near Universal. where John's bungalow is on the Universal Lot. And Kenny said, I have a proposition for you because you're a Sonic Solutions user, which was the editing platform. And he had worked on magnetic tape, referred to as MAG, his whole career, but he was going to have to transition to digital. So he said, if you will be my hands and do the editing, and I'll tell you where to edit, or we'll look at the scores or whatever, and then do the editing for film, I'll teach you how to be a music editor for film. And I thought to myself, okay, that's about the best deal one could ever possibly get. So I agreed to it and said, absolutely. So we did a little movie called Stepmom, which was a rescore that John was doing. I think Pat Doyle had written the original score, and the filmmakers decided it was too, it just wasn't working for them. So they asked John to do the score, and John did the score for him. Chris Columbus was the director. And then he said, and then we're going to do a Star Wars movie. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. So that's how I sort of started out. And I started as an assistant music editor, and I was probably an assistant for 4 or 5 movies. And I worked as an assistant for some other people. And then,
Hey, Pete, can I interrupt you just for 1 second?
Yes.
I forgot to mute.
I can't hear you at all, Glenn.
We turn him up a little bit in the house. Can you all hear him okay? Okay, you can. Good. I'm having just it's my,
I'll speak up a little bit. So basically I started out as an assistant, and then John started to get very busy. So Kenny and I would sort of split the tasks. I stayed with John while he wrote Minority Report, while Kenny was dubbing, or mixing rather, Star Wars up at the ranch. As soon as we finished scoring for Minority Report, I flew to London to temp Harry Potter 2. It was sort of that thing, and it became very busy. And then gradually I ended up having a career as a music editor, and sort of went off on my own and worked with a lot of other people. And I've been very fortunate. I mean, in terms of meeting interesting composers, I worked with John, obviously. I worked with James Newton Howard on King Kong, and John Powell on the Bourne films. And I mean, and it's been a very interesting journey. But what I would say is, and Glenn and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, what I learned in music school is what I use all day, every day. A basic understanding of harmony, an understanding of orchestration, and I'll get into what the job is, but harmony, orchestration, solfege, musicianship, all that stuff. I mean, that doesn't teach you a film sense, but it teaches you how to work within the medium. And honestly, without that stuff, I don't think I would have been able to work on the projects that I worked on. There are some music editors who, have different backgrounds, which are very well suited to certain things. But if you're going to be dealing with orchestra a lot, it's very handy to at least understand that, these two things go together and these two things don't go together, and understanding why and being able to get to that fairly quickly, which is probably a good segue into what the job actually is. Would you think that that's a good thing to go with, Glenn?
No, sure. And I remember also at NEC, you were really
I was a
passionate
solfege TA.
You were really passionate about solfege.
Yes, and I still think do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. I mean, that's still the way I think about music. I don't usually use it like in a recording session because it sounds pretentious, but my brain is wired that way. I mean, and that's sort of the wiring. And I think that honestly, the work that I did with Larry Scripp at NEC taught me a lot about everything. I mean, the guy was like he was just a wonderful, mentor, and and I understand he's just retired, but he was amazing. So what does and I could talk about two things briefly. I'll talk about what I did in the record business. The record business basically was, you would maybe, like with Rampal, we'd book like 4 days and we'd have a bunch of music that we needed to record. So we'd start off, and usually the way I would do it is we would do a take. I would be in a booth in a separate room and he was playing with his pianist. And I would be in the booth and maybe have him play the whole movement all the way down once and just kind of get our bearings and mess around with the microphones, which I didn't do, but the recording engineer would mess around with microphones. And then we would maybe, see how it was all going. And then we'd start doing takes. So maybe we would do 2 complete takes. And then we'd start going in and doing patches. So if you needed bars 67 to 69, you would have him play from bar 60 to bar 80. So you had enough handles on either side so you could edit it together. And you would kind of gradually do that. Now, if you were running into an issue where, say, for instance, for what some reason the flutist or the pianist or whoever was having a little difficulty with something, you'd work on it a little while. And then if you felt like it was, not really improving necessarily, you might go on and do something else for a while so you could keep a sense of momentum and positivity going, and then come back to it a little later when maybe everyone's forgotten whatever the issue was and do a few more takes. But you'd have a score in front of you and you'd mark the score as you went. I mean, I think that the most challenging project I did was a recording of the Shanghai Conservatory faculty who were playing ancient Chinese instruments, but modern music. And what was funny about that was, well, I don't really know what these instruments sound like, because they're not, you're looking at it, but I don't, they're not in your lexicon. It's not like, okay, the flute is out of tune. You can look at the score, but the score reading exercise in terms of trying to figure that out was amazing, because it's like, what instrument was that? Because they're just not things that were in my lexicon. So anyway, so that's a little bit about and then you could edit a record. I did the Brandenburg Concerti with Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, and I edited the record for 2 months. Because you could go in, if there's a better 2 beats in another take, you're going to go in and take it. But that's looking at recording music, not as like, it's not like you're trying to catch a live performance. It's like you're trying to make this thing, this thing. You want it to sound organic, but you also don't want there to be an A flat that's out of tune for, all perpetuity. So film music editing, and I'll sort of walk you through what we do. So when I start a project, usually it's when the director is starting his assembly, or the editor maybe is starting his assembly. They've just shot the movie, or they're still shooting the movie, and they want to start putting some music in. So, you think about what could work, and this is temporary music. So I have a vast collection of soundtracks. The orchestral scores, you try to get as many complete orchestral scores as you can, because generally the scenes that are like people talking or whatever aren't things that end up on a commercial soundtrack, but those are the cues that you end up needing a lot of, because obviously that happens in movies a lot.
So this is an interesting point here, and I just want to make sure that everyone understands the little step you just explained, and because it's not really apparent in the title music editor. You're hired to do a lot of things, the first of which is to make a mock-up of some kind of a film soundtrack in the film.
It's a temporary score.
Temporary score.
And the purpose of the temporary score is to make the movie play and hopefully inform the filmmakers, the composer who's going to come down the road in the process. Okay, well, this is a pacing that works, or this is not a pacing that works, or this is the right amount of emotion, or this isn't the right amount of emotion. The action we can push it here, but when you start adding horns and trumpets, it's too much. So maybe that's not the right mood and tone. Should the scene be emotional? Should it be tense? Should it start out emotional and become tense? You know, two people are talking, then they gradually get into an argument. The music needs to morph. It can start out, you know, neutral, and then it needs to morph to something that's more tense. So you create, basically, it's called a temp job, and it's a temporary score. It's also, if you've ever gotten one of those invitations, that I don't know if this happens in Colorado that much, but it happens a lot in LA, where they say, pardon me, how'd you like to come to a free movie tonight? That's usually a preview. And so they'll take the movie out to show an audience. And the music, at least certainly for the first preview, is usually temporary music. It's a challenging thing because the movie is always changing. And sometimes, you know, as the scenes change, music you had before doesn't work anymore and you need to rethink it. And then everybody has an opinion on it, obviously, because everybody has an opinion about music. So I like it, I don't like it. You know, it's a little bit of a brutal game sometimes. But you just have to sort of soldier through and try to make everybody happy. The people I work with primarily are the film's director and the film editors and the music supervisor if there are songs. But those are the people who I primarily work with.
So
now, yes.
What is your relationship with the eventual film composer?
Well, that's what I was gonna. That's what we should talk about now. So then, at some point in time, the composer comes on, and you do a lot of coordination with them. You make sure they have the right version of picture. You might talk to them about issues that you had in the temping process, good or bad, that might be useful for them. You'll have a session with the director and editors, usually where you'll talk about the music in the movie. You know, the temp music, and what the score eventually should be. Hopefully the temp at least gave them an idea about pacing and general tone. But that's not always the case. And the great composers can look at the temp, say, I understand what that is, and then do something completely different. I will say that I think that in the old days, like when I worked with Michael Kahn on War of the Worlds, he would just sort of slap in a piece of music and that was the end of it. And that Michael Kahn has been Steven Spielberg's editor for like 40 years or whatever, you know. And Mike would just throw something in and that would be the end of it. And we wouldn't even talk about it. And John would look at it once and say, oh, you know, I understand what Mike was going for, and that would be the end of it. Now it has become a thing where they want it to be like a score, which I don't think is the best thing for creativity, because sometimes I think you could box people into a corner a little bit in terms of what's expected, because everybody's used to this tonal idea or whatever. So I mean, it is what it is. I don't think it's the best thing for movies. I think it's better when it was a little bit loose and, you know, but also the movie business has changed a little bit, and it's much more corporate. So there are shareholders and there's numbers, and the numbers are important. Anyway, I diverge from the path that we want to be on. So the composer sees the movie, and the composer is going to start writing some themes and present some ideas. And once people settle on that, he'll start working on writing the cues. And we'll have meetings with the director and editors, and we'll look at the music, and they'll have notes, and they might say, okay, well, you know what? I think it should be a little sadder here, or a little happier, or should we pick up the pace on this cut, or should we hit this cut, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, we have these conversations, and the composers write demos. So they write synth demos. I mean, the demos are amazing now. And I think Hans Zimmer had a lot to do with that. The samples are amazing and the demos are amazing. I mean, an oboe sample doesn't sound very good, but horns and trombones and strings it's incredible what can be accomplished. And eventually some of that stuff may get into the movie for preview. And certainly there's an approval process. Meanwhile, the picture is still changing. Scenes are getting shorter, longer. Usually a movie starts out fat and they compress it because they want to know what they have. And then, you know, they'll go to a preview and the audience will feel like this joke or that joke isn't landing or whatever. And then, you know, they'll tweak that. So then eventually you're going to get to the point where you're going to actually record the music. So the composer's music will go to orchestrators, and it will be orchestrated, and then it will be printed, and we'll have recording sessions. Typically in Hollywood nowadays, you'll record the strings and brass separately. And part of that is so that there's control when you're mixing the film, so you can you sort of you can lower the brass a little bit or raise them or whatever. And we'll get into mixing in a second. That's the way they do it. Is it the best way to do it? No. I mean, the way John Williams does it, when everybody's in the room together and there's that sort of symbiotic relationship between all the players, that's a better way to do it. But that's not what really works in Hollywood these days. It works for John, obviously, because he's John. But for everybody else, you know, you'll record the strings and brass separately for the most part, and woodwinds. And then there'll be synths and all this kind of stuff. So you have recording sessions. You might record for a week, and it's fairly intense. And often what I will do, although there are people who do this, I mean, I do this because I used to do this for a living. Then I'll take all the takes and edit together the best takes. So maybe there are 4 takes of this one cue, and I'll take the best bits of each section and edit that together and make sure the timing is good. Because a lot of the time with programming and with synths, if you have a line, the orchestra's got to be tight with it, because the synth is not going to be moving, because the synth is on, you know, the way programming works, it's on a grid. So if it's 90 BPM, even if it's going to eventually slow down or speed up or whatever, the stuff's got to be tight. And people will sometimes say to me, but why does it have to be, you know, you want it to sound natural? And I always say, yes, but if you have 3 drums doing something and they're not together, it's going to be chaos by the time you add the orchestra and the synths and everything. It's got to be tight. It'll sound natural. Trust me. It's got to be tight. So then we have this process, and then it all goes to a mixer, a music mixer. And he's basically a recording engineer. He probably recorded the music, the score originally, and now he will mix the synthesizers, the brass, the strings, the percussion. He'll mix all of that together. And then he will separate them into stems. So you'll have strings, brass, high perk, mid perk, low perk. You know, obviously all the stuff has to have been recorded together. High perk, mid perk, low perk, you know, synths, pulses, whatever. And so now I have this thing. He does all of that and he gets the levels just right. He's not mixing against the movie. He's just making it a musical thing from here to here. So if you put it on a record, that's what it would sound like. You know, it sounds great. So we've done that. And now we have to mix the movie. Well, what has often happens is that there are picture changes that have gone on since the music got orchestrated. And that's where I have to edit the music to make it match the picture. And that's where it can get tricky. Now, obviously, if they did this and this and this, and they moved scenes around and all that kind of stuff, sometimes that's a redo, because you can imagine naturally, musically, that's not necessarily going to work. But, and I can tell you a short story about that, where it did work. Kenny Wanberg was doing the Indiana Jones movie, and I can't remember which one it was, but it was the one where Indy and his father are, I think they're in like a fireplace, and the fireplace is twisting, and it's going like this from the good guys to the bad guys, the good guys to the bad guys. But Stephen went in and moved everything around. So, you know, you can imagine bum ba bum would be on the good guys, and then something on the bad guys. But Kenny somehow or other, if you ever watch that sequence, it's amazing. Kenny figured out a way to musically move it all around, and it sounds like music still. And part of that is having an understanding of harmony and orchestration. So Anyway, I digress. So then my job is to get the music in sync. Now, what can happen is you've got the music in sync, you're ready to go mix a movie. Well, I show up at a mixing stage, and this is called re-recording mixing. And I show up with my music, and the sound effects guys show up with 800 tracks of sound effects. And the dialogue guys show up with their dialogue and ADR, which is additional dialogue recording, so that it's, or looping as they call it. So, if somebody, somebody said a line and meanwhile off stage, somebody dropped a hammer on a bucket, you're going to have to get that performance again, and it's fake. Or they don't like the way somebody says a line or whatever. They'll go in and do that. So we all show up together on a dubbing stage, and then we just start mixing the movie. Usually they'll do a dialogue pass, and then they'll do a dialogue and music pass together to just get the music relative to the dialogue in about the right place. And then the sound effects guy will come in and put his sound effects 8 dB too loud, so you can't hear the music. And then you'll have a sidebar about it and say, nobody left the theater whistling a doggy bark. That's a joke, obviously. It's not really like that. But I mean, things can get testy once in a while. But there are a lot of great sound guys out there, and they do wonderful stuff. So then we have this mixing process, and then eventually, usually we'll sort of do that on our own, myself and the mixer and the sound effects guys and the sound effects mixer. And then we'll play it for the director. And then what happens sometimes is the director will say, you know what, that cue right there, or that part of the movie right there, it's just not working for me. Do we have something else in the score that we could try there? And then you'll go back to your room and you'll go through the score and you'll think about it and you say, okay, well, he wants it to be a little more tense. Can I keep what we have and add like a pulse to it, or some tension chords in the brass that were in this cue from like earlier or whatever? And you'll try to do that, or maybe the composer will have to get involved, and you could send them a sketch and say, it mostly works, but could we add some synth brass here to just like really sell this idea or whatever? So that's kind of, so we get into that process, and then eventually we'll show the movie to the studio, and they'll have some notes, and we'll go back and address those notes, and that's sort of the process. The one thing I didn't talk about is songs, which are often a big part of a movie. And generally one works with a music supervisor, and you will try hundreds of songs sometimes to try to like figure out what could work with the scene. Now, if it's a montage, once you settle on a song, you will likely have to give it back to the picture editor to finagle the picture to work with the song. That doesn't necessarily happen with score. I mean, if you're in a real pinch, but often for some reason they're more willing to do it with the song than they are with the score. But if you're a 4 on the floor, like say you're doing a heist film, and you're 4/4 hardcore 4/4, even score wise, it can get a little dicey because you don't want to be dropping 5/8 bars all over the place. Now, we have some tools we can use where we can adjust tempo a little bit. There is a sound degradation, but you can do it, and we do it a lot. And certainly on some of John Williams' scores where you would need to make changes, you might find yourself even changing the key because you had to go from this to this, and the key relationship isn't good. But if you lower the B part a half step, it is good. So you'll do that. There's a little sound degradation, but if there's fighter jets on top of it, you're not really going to hear it. So that's kind of what you do. So that, I mean, I think in a nutshell, that is at least sort of, is that fairly clear, Glenn, to you what that, I can't hear you, but you're muted.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And so interesting how multi-layered the process actually is. And the interplay in your position, like in Rapp's analytical, critical thinking, problem solving, heavy collaboration. It must be
interesting. Politics, and that's something to talk about. The politics can be tricky because you can have competing agendas. Maybe the studio has something, and Glenn, I'm fine if you're not muted. I don't really hear myself, but you know, you might have a composer who's delivered a score that the studio likes, but the director's having issues, or the director loves a score and the studio's having issues. You know, you can have any of those sort of political things when you get a bunch of people working together. It's funny, the writer Chris Morgan, who wrote a lot of the Fast and Furious movies, had a good expression. He said, in Hollywood, it's always ABC, always be cool. Now, what he means by that obviously is not literally cool, but try to keep it even keeled. But I can tell you from my own personal experience that a lot of the times I've been hired for things, especially by other music editors, because often we'll need help with something or whatever. A lot of the times I've been hired for things, I've been hired because I'm a team player. I'm going to come in. I'll give you an example. I worked on the last Star Wars movie, and it was the final crunch, and there were about 10 days in. And there was a lot of, we were changing things. Picture was still changing. There was a lot to do. And John was around a fair amount also. And I finally met the post-production supervisor. I met the director after about 4 or 5 days. And I finally met the post-production person for Lucasfilm on the last day. It's literally my last day. Because I understood that the job in that case was to go in and quietly work and help them get to where they needed to get without, making a big deal about it. Just quietly go in, do the work, keep your mouth shut. And, obviously you're going to give them your musical opinion, and I would show cues to John. He'd say, that's great, but, maybe this or that or whatever. We would do that kind of stuff. And the same with J.J. Abrams. But the most important thing was to go in and not make any waves. Now, that's not to say that that's the right approach for everything. I did a movie once with a director who had never had music in a movie that he'd done, and he'd been nominated for an Academy Award, but it was a first smaller movie. And basically, I would play him stuff every day, and usually the answer was no, because the music was too much for him, because he was so used to having a narrative that didn't have music that anytime there was music, he's like, and obviously I was going, for that movie, I was going outside of the typical Hollywood score lane. I was trying to get something that was more, because I knew he'd be more comfortable with that. But my job in that case was to just keep bashing away at it and keep doing what I could do. And not say to him, look, man, you got to pick something because we're getting in trouble here. Now, there might be a situation that you're in where you are like that, where you do have to say to them, guys, we can't keep fooling around like this because people are getting uncomfortable with having a movie with no music, and we got to get some stuff in here. Or we got to get some stuff in here that's doing some work to help the movie. So and then there are other movies where you might have to be very aggressive with people, but always cool. But But my point with all of this, as I'm blathering on and on here, is people hire me because they know I'm not going to go in and have my own agenda. I'm not going to play games with the studio. I'm not going to play games with the director. I'm not going to play games with the editor. And that's an important life lesson. And earlier in my career, I could be cranky sometimes because I'd spend a lot of time with, very experienced guys that could be cranky sometimes. But what I found was that wasn't necessarily the right approach. And so I guess the lesson here is, as my two things: one, figure out where the paycheck is coming from, and two, always be cool. So that's that. I mean, if you want to see an example, Glenn has queued up something. We're going to look at something from Jason Bourne, which is the movie I Tempt, and we're going to look at what the temp music does.
So,
and so we should let's watch it without any music first.
okay. And so you made this temp music, is that correct?
Yes,
Yeah.
And I'll explain it afterwards, but let's watch like a minute or so dry.
And you did. You always did. That's why you volunteered.
I volunteered because I thought our enemies killed him. I volunteered because of a lie.
No, you volunteered because of who you are. You volunteered because you are Jason Bourne and not David Webb. "32 kills, Jason. Every one of them made a difference. People all across this country are safer because of what you did."
I'm trying to find another way.
Okay, so I think, Glenn, that's probably gives us an indication of how that plays without music. And now, pardon me, what you're going to hear is temporary music, and I'll explain it after you've seen it. You'll hear a version with temporary music, and it is using the John Powell, Jason Bourne theme at the end. But let's watch the whole clip, and then we can see sort of what that feels like.
You took a long time to get here, Jason.
I know about Beirut. I know what you did. It all ends tonight.
You didn't come here for revenge. You came here because you know it's time to come in. Your father created the program, didn't have what it takes to make it work, and you did. You always did. That's why you volunteered.
I volunteered because I thought our enemies killed him. I volunteered because of a lie.
No, you volunteered because of who you are. You volunteered because you are Jason Bourne and not David Webb. "32 kills, Jason. Every one of them made a difference. People all across this country are safer because of what you did."
I'm trying to find another way.
And how's that working out for you? You're never going to find any peace. Not until you admit to yourself who you really are. It's time to come in, Jason.
Not for you.
You don't have to go after him. This can stop now. You have a choice.
So, get upstairs.
Have your IDs ready, ladies and gentlemen. Please make orderly lines at the door, please.
That's temporary music up until the end of dee da da dee da dum, dee da da dee da dum, which was from one of the original Bourne films. On that film, I had an interesting task. Through editing the stems together, I did arrangements of about 30% of the score. That basically I did the arrangements and then they took them down, and that ended up in the movie. But anyway, so the thinking and I'll just talk through musically what I was thinking about doing this temp job. At that point in the movie, this is like sort of the climax of this. These two characters are coming together, and this is when they finally meet. So it starts out, boom, boom. And it's sort of For Whom the Bell Tolls. You know, this is Jason Bourne. This has become a revenge film instead of him doing the noble thing, typically. So by the time, you know, after 3 films, this is like a different beast. And it's all coming to a head. And then there are those cluster chords, which were from Captain America, the Winter Soldier, I believe, Henry Jackman. And there's these clusters. What's interesting about the clusters is that they are both tense and sad simultaneously. Then he starts to walk across the room and he says, I did it for the country. And we go to these sort of brass chords that are noble and sad simultaneously. And then obviously the tension starts to ramp up. You know, you cut to the gentleman who's running towards the room to help Dewey. And, you know, you want to play those cuts, but you don't want to hammer them too hard because it's still part of, we're really with Jason Bourne. We're not really with this other guy running, but narratively, we have to keep doing that. And then at the end of the scene, when he, and also there, throughout the scene, there's this boom, boom. The bell continues to toll, boom, boom. Then at the end of the scene, to me, these two characters are sort of, you know, they're finally meeting, and it's a tragedy in a way. And this is a tragedy because this guy, that's her boss, everything has gone sideways, and it's sad. But for Jason, it's like now he's brought another person into the scene. And I mean, this is just getting worse and worse. But it's sad. It's not tension and anger, but it's like this moment of like brief catharsis for the two characters when they look at each other and you know, she says, you don't have to do this, and he says, yes, I do. That's a tragedy in a sense, but hopefully played with a light touch, as it were, to not overwhelm the scene and let the actors do what they do. Now, the next question is, so how do you learn that? How do you learn to do this and temp a scene? And the honest answer is, it becomes an instinct thing. And I didn't know really anything about movies when I started in the business, and I probably still don't know that much, but that is something that I think that you learn through time watching movies and absorbing it. And I couldn't tell you for the life of me why I think one piece of music works in one place and one piece doesn't. But when I go and I start listening to scores and I'm like, I think that could work in that scene, and I do it. It's things start to come together. Now, if you're having a lot of interference and trying to do your job, then your chi can get like sort of thrown up in chaos, and then it becomes harder to have those moments where you're listening to something, you're like, oh, I wonder if I go to that score, if that might work. There are obvious things. If you're doing an action movie, you're going to look at the music of James Newton Howard and Henry Jackman and Lorne Balfe and Hans Zimmer and all these people. And if you're doing an arty thing, you might look at the music of Olafur Arnalds, or you might look at what Alexandre Desplat, or stuff like this. But I think that the best training in a way is watching movies and observing things and being open to, possibilities and stuff like that. And for that scene, it probably took me better part of a day to figure out what to do. Because I would try this and try that, and it's pushing too hard. And trying to settle into that place where it's sitting, but you're catching those little moments. And, Dewey says something, and then you cut back to Bourne, and there's a chord, and there's a little boom. You know what I mean? Which you feel, and you're like, some bad stuff is going to happen here. But, at all the time trying to, escalation, because music in film is primarily about emotion and escalation or de-escalation.
Interesting. That's so interesting, Pete. Thanks so much for that detailed explanation. I don't think we realize how honed the pacing has to be in a sequence like that. And you can notice it. I've watched it 3 or 4 times, and with the 4th time watching it, like noticing these very, very incremental steps, one way or the other. And with timbre too. You came out of music school, you came out of NEC and then master's at Northwestern. And part of that education was learning a lot about music, learning a lot of literature, learning a lot of music history. And so how has that been a real asset for your job? Does that sort of set you apart in some ways compared to maybe others that haven't gone through such, strong?
I think score reading is important. I mean, the things that maybe I did in music school that other people did a little bit, but maybe I did a little. I took some conducting classes, which has been helpful. And score reading, obviously, when I was working at a record company, score reading was critical. I think those are skills that maybe not everybody has. I think that, obviously if it's a period drum, I think that understanding, for instance, this is like understanding that if you want to put some string quartet in the scene and they're playing classical music, that Haydn is a better choice than Beethoven, because Haydn is generally more simple and more user-friendly. I think those are like little things that you would just know that, okay, we should try this. Or, a big band thing, a la whatever, would be better than something else if they want something that has scale and, yada, yada, yada. I think that all of that stuff is, it has been helpful. Look, it's a total package. I think that, going back to what Larry Scripp used to say, being flexible is important. And I think that if you know a little bit about a lot of things. Now, I will say one thing. I don't know anything about recording engineering other than plugging something in. I don't know anything about that, and I kind of wish I had learned a little bit about that. So I would say for the students, to know a little bit about that in this culture is useful. I wouldn't know what I can say. It sounds too tight. There's too much reverb on it, or whatever. And I can get into mixing things like, this is too loud, this is too soft. I can have like opinions about mixes, but man, when it comes to like, I wouldn't know how to set something up to record to save my life. And I think that that's nowadays, knowing those things, those are all useful tools to have.
What was your favorite movie you worked on?
Every movie was different. And it's funny. I loved Angela's Ashes because I loved the movie and I loved the score, and Alan Parker, God bless him. And Jake, of course, Alan Parker's son went to NEC with us, which is a funny coincidence.
Yeah.
But Alan Parker was a character. He had directed Midnight Express, which was a very crazy movie, and he had done Evita, and he'd done all kinds of things. And he was difficult and cranky and talented and very interesting. And I didn't have to deal with any of the unpleasantness, I think probably because, you know, Jake, not unpleasantness, but he could be very passionate but he was always very nice to me. I mean, that was a wonderful movie. I think that when you got to the end of the first Harry Potter, you sort of understood that something special was happening, and that score was wonderful. And there were moments of watching these scores go down at the end of the movie where you were like, oh my God, that is just fantastic. I think, Steven's movies were interesting for all kinds of different reasons. King Kong was amazing because James Newton Howard wrote that score in 6 weeks. Wow. He wrote 3 hours of music in 6 weeks. And I once was talking to him and he started writing, and it was one of those situations where you weren't sure, am I supposed to leave? Am I supposed to just sit on the couch? And so I didn't know what to do literally. So I just sat on the couch, and he was working on a T-Rex fight, and to see his facility on the synth was absolutely mind-blowing. I mean, he had been a pianist. I think he'd gone to USC, and he'd been Elton John's pianist. But the facility was mind-boggling, the ability to write. So that's the long and short of it. And obviously there are people, the years that I worked with Kenny Womberg were wonderful years. And I've, met a lot of great people. I mean, I worked on Dune a little bit, which will be coming out later this year, temping it. Joe Walker and Denis Villeneuve are two amazing human beings. Joe was the editor and Denis the director, and they're amazing. The answer to the second question, which I see, what did you realize you wanted to do? I fell into the film business. I sort of enjoyed the classical record business, but in 1998, Tower Records decided they were going to be paying the record. The record industry collapsed in 1998. That was the beginning of the major collapse. But certainly the classical places, it was a whole, the record companies were, or the record stores were going to pay, instead of paying you every month, they were going to pay you every 2 months. And there was like a Black Thursday at the record company where they laid off some people and yada, yada, yada. And it was a big thing. And I read the writing on the wall, and the writing on the wall was, you better find another job and you better figure out something else to do. I didn't know anything about music editing. When I started with Kenny, I knew how to use Sonic Solutions, but he told me to backsync something. To backsync something is essentially, if a song ends on the cut to the whatever, you just lay it in so that the song ends there, and then you pull it forward and see where you start. Then you might make edits, etc. But he said, backsync this. And I said, what's a backsync? I mean, I didn't know anything. So so it's something that I fell into because of Tim Morrison, frankly. and then you just sort of start doing it. And then I think probably like much of life, it just starts happening. If that makes any sense. It's kind of a weird, but I think having a solid musical foundation was helpful. And I didn't know anything about film, and I never took a film class, and I still don't know anything about film, I would argue. But that's kind of what happened.
So what advice, and this probably asked for a long answer, but the long and short of it, what advice would you give students trying to go out and make a career in the industry these days?
Well, I mean, look, if you wanted to become a music editor, what I would suggest is become a composer's assistant. So I think that people who, like, for instance, study composition at Berkeley or something like that, who know composer's assistant obviously has to be very technically savvy. In the old days, you'd help a music editor out, you'd load in CDs or tapes or whatever. There was a lot of assistant music editor work, and there's not a lot of that now. So I think that, if you were studying composition and you knew how Cubase worked and all these programs, and you were real, very knowledgeable in that stuff, that would be a good way to get in, because then you would learn the process. I mean, you might start as an intern or whatever, but then you could sort of learn the process that way, and then get into temping or whatever, and maybe, figure things out that way. I just think that but like anything else, if you pursue excellence whenever you can, that's the way, because things will happen if you pursue excellence. Does that make sense?
That's a great last point. And I think what, I wanted our students to get from this session with you is, in particular, that the things you're learning here in the music program, in the major, a lot of them are skills that are very useful out there. They're very practical, and there's a place for them in the world. And they're unique skills. They're very unique skills that other people from other majors and fields, filmmaking, don't necessarily have. And they're very specialized. So, well, Pete, thank you so much. This was super enjoyable and really informative. And thank you for sharing your experience and knowledge. And we'll have to have you here in person.
I would love to do that, Glenn.
When we're able to do that again. And thank you so much. And
well, we'll talk soon. Cheers.
See you later. All right.
Bye-bye.
Take care.